Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here at the George Washington University. I am so delighted to welcome all of you to the 2025 Bromley Memorial Event and Keynote Lecture by Dr. Rob Atkinson, who is President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He will address U.S. science policy at a crossroads. The Bromley Memorial event began as a collaboration between the University of Ottawa and the George Washington University. The late Professor John de la Motte, a former Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa, launched this initiative in 2005 with his GW colleague, Professor Nick Vinortas. It's obviously the 20th anniversary of this great lecture. The event engages graduate students from Canada and the United States, and it alternates between Ottawa and Washington, D.C. The event is in honor of the Canada-born science advisor to President George H.W. Bush, Dr. D. Allen Bromley, who was instrumental in championing Canada-U.S. science and technology relations during his tenure. The signature activity of each Bromley event is the public Bromley Lecture, delivered by a leader in science, technology, and innovation policy. In 2021, the lecture was here in Washington, online, we were in the pandemic, by Dr. Sethuraman Panchanathan, who was director of the U.S. National Science Foundation. In 2022, Dr. Mona Nimer, Chief Science Advisor of Canada, delivered the Bromley Lecture in Ottawa. In 2023, Dr. Bhavya Lal, Associate Administrator at the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, gave the lecture here in D.C. And last year, Dr. Remy Curion, Chief Scientist of Quebec, gave the lecture on science diplomacy in Ottawa. Previous speakers have also included science advisors from India, the United States, and China. I think you're probably all aware that the turmoil in research-intensive higher education across the United States makes this year's lecture particularly topical. I will now turn to Professor Vinortas to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Rob Atkinson, and thank you all again for joining us for this important lecture.
Thank you, Alyssa. Good afternoon, everybody. You used the word turmoil. I thought of an old song. Times they are changing. If you have not heard that song by Bob Dylan, an old American folk singer, please listen to it and actually read the lyrics very, very carefully. It came out sometime in the 60s when still in countries like the old country of mine, somewhere in a little corner of Europe, students had to hide under the desks, training for a nuclear attack or for earthquakes. And since then, times have changed quite a bit. We went from a Cold War into Pax Americana, into sort of not knowing exactly whether we want globalization, into a system against globalization these days. And that has meant significant turmoil. We thought we understood the system, but these days we think that the system has escaped exactly our understanding. There are a lot of good facts, and I think the speaker will speak about this, but let me give you a few as a background, just a background. This country today spends about $1 trillion in research. This is bigger than the GDP of most countries on the globe. Just very few produce more than $1 trillion per year. That has made the enterprise quite visible politically. We cannot hide that expenditure under the rug anymore. There is also a few other things. there is an understanding out there that the government funds basic research and the private sector funds applied research or development. You know, that is not really very true anymore. The federal government, as always, in some parts of it, like the Department of Defense, funds development research, and it continues to fund basic research. But it's the private sector now, which accounts for more than 3/4 of the total expenditure and more than 3/4 of the total undertaking of research, that funds 40% of basic research in the United States. Now, these facts, what I just mentioned, and I'm sure Rob will expand on this, is not really the system that Vannevar Bush, who wrote that famous report to the American president, to President Truman, got it, had in mind when he actually advocated that science should not be, now that the war is over, should not be dismantled. It should continue because it will create all these good things for the economy. I don't know if you paid a lot of attention, my students have, but others into that report. Bush did not talk a lot about manufacturing. It was an afterthought. Of course, things would go into manufacturing. And why he should worry about manufacturing? The United States was the manufacturing power in the world. Nobody was even getting close, right? It was the production system in the world. These days, as we see, are different. And thus, we in universities, and I think many others in many other sectors, are feeling the change. So times are changing, and we are looking for ways to respond to this. What is happening these days, which surprises a lot people in our profession, is not actually an accident. For many years, the ruling party today, the administration, that party had advocated that we need to shrink the government. They could not get to it. Today, they can. And research, being such a big part, such a visible part, is also bearing some consequences that we see in the newspapers every day. So without further ado, I want to introduce the speaker. Today's speaker is actually a very prominent figure in the city and internationally in science and technology and innovation policy. He has written extensively. I believe all of you have seen his name on reports and on papers. And what makes it particularly interesting is that this is the 20th anniversary of this event. Rob Atkinson, right here, is actually a Canadian by birth, the same way that Alan Bromley was a Canadian by birth, but both of them have had their major part of their careers in this country, in the United States. Both of them served various presidents, and just let me read something for the speaker. So President Clinton was the first one who appointed Rob Atkinson to the Commission on Workers, Communities and Economic Change in the New Economy. The new economy was the time of the Pax Americana. You know, this after the Soviet Union has crumbled. The Bush administration appointed him chair of the congressionally created National Surface Transportation Infrastructure Financing Commission. Infrastructure. The Obama administration appointed him to the National Innovation and Competitiveness Strategy Advisory Board as co-chair of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policies China-U.S. Innovation Policy Experts Group, right? And to the Department of Commerce, the National Advisory Council of that department. The Biden administration appointed him, just look at the administrations as we go forward, right? The Biden administration appointed him as a member of the US State Department's Advisory Committee on International Communications and Information, and a member of the Export-Import Bank of the United States Council on China's Competition. So you cannot say that this man does not understand government and does not understand science and technology policy. We thought he would be the perfect. I've read most of what he's producing. My students often read what he's producing, and we thought that this year he could only be the best speaker ever. Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And Nick, thank you. And really honor to be talking at an event named after such a distinguished science policy leader that linked together North America. Nick, I don't know if it was Trump derangement syndrome that made you leave off my appointment by the Trump administration to the Global Partnership on AI, but I also did that. So Nick mentioned Bob Dylan, and one of the great lines of that song is, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." So I think you probably do, and I'm going to try to be the weatherman here today. Let me start by saying, I don't think you can understand how radical the Trump administration is and the new wing of the Republican Party. Let's just start there. We're not in normal times. I don't mean that in a partisan way. We're not partisan at all, as you noted. I think the simplest way to understand what Trump is all about is he wants to go back to the year 1912. That is optimal territory for the Republicans. A lot of Republicans want to go back before the New Deal, but Trump wants to go back even further. No income tax, very, very, very small government. Most of U.S. government was operated by the states. That's really what Trump wants. And protectionism, tariff, and really the role of the U.S. being the Monroe Doctrine at best, take care of the northern and southern hemispheres and leave the rest of the world alone. I really think that's what this administration and the new movement is all about. So what are the implications of that for science? Clearly, I think they're significant. One, which doesn't even bear mentioning, is significant cuts in funding. So I think that means that the science community faces this real sort of fork in the road. It can say, well, if we just have a few more rallies to say NIH funding is good, or we do a few more coalition letters up to the Hill to say, hey, Senate Commerce, keep the funding up, it'll all work. I don't believe that. As Nick alluded to, I think if science is going to survive in a real way and move forward in a way of progress, it has to do two main things. It has to reject the Vannevar Bush model. It's done, it's dead, yet most of the people in the science community love it, and I'll tell you why. And then, and this is where I risk getting into more controversy, it really has to repudiate the anti-science DEI that was prevalent over the last 8 years in the science community. You want to know why Trump is going after some of these universities? Because they went too far with DEI, social justice. I mean, you look at the Penn funding. He's trying to cut University of Penn funding. One reason only, that's because they let some guy join the women's swimming team. That's it. So this is an administration that wants to kill that movement, and we can argue whether it's good or bad, and I'm not going to get in that argument, but that's where we are. So I'm really going to do three things. I'm going to talk quickly about sort of the stages of science policy before World War II, a little bit of where we are now in terms of both the Trump view on budgets and DEI, and then about some steps I think that the community overall needs to embrace to go forward. So again, this is where Trump wants to go. Before World War II, there was very little federal support for science. There was some support for agriculture that really was a tradition after the Civil War and beyond. There was some support for aeronautics research, but by and large, there was very little. Federal support for R&D was 0.1% of GDP. So it just wasn't there. Mostly it was universities were funded on their own, or industry gave them money, or foundations gave them money. That all changed, obviously, in World War II when it became clear we had to mobilize the entire scientific and technological establishment to beat the Axis powers. And so that was where we got this Endless Frontier document. But what you may or may not remember is there was a huge debate at the time between Bush, Vannevar Bush, saying sort of the endless frontier, just sort of let us do what we want to do. Just give us money. Don't tell us what to do. Don't do anything related to commercialization. Just give us money and wonderful things will happen, which is the linear model of research. And the debate between him and a fellow by the name of Harley Kilgore, who was a senator from West Virginia, and he said, no, wait a minute. If we're going to do all this science stuff, it has to be tied into a public purpose. And that was the debate. And Bush won, Kilgore lost. So there were several, probably five key aspects of that model, which really prevailed until the late 80s. Number one, it was high levels of federal funding. So in the early 60s, we went from, as I said, 0.2% or 0.1% up to 2% of GDP. But we're not there now. We're, what are we at, 0.7 maybe? Something like that. Now, yeah, 0.7 federal support. Pardon? Thank you. I think it was 6.18. Good. Right. I appreciate that. Here's an interesting stat. In 1960s, the early 60s, the US government funded more research and science than the rest of the world, business and government combined. So take every other government in the world, every corporation that's not an American corporation, add up all of their funding on science, the US government exceeded it. You want to understand why we became the world science leader? That's why. I mean, there are several reasons, but that's key. So the second aspect of that was that the funding should go to the best universities and researchers. Geographic representation, geographic diversity really had no place for it. So if it all went to Caltech and it all went to MIT and it all went to Columbia, that's best for science. The third was no strings. It was you submit your proposals and the best one wins. Doesn't matter what discipline it's in, doesn't matter anything. And this is what Bush said. He said, quote, scientific progress on a broad front results from the free play of free intellects working on subjects of their own choice in a manner dictated by their curiosity for exploration of the unknown. Freedom of inquiry must be preserved under any plan for government support of science. So that's like the key right there. That's it. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're a professional or you're in a business, that's exactly what you want your mission statement to be. Give me money to do whatever the hell I want. Like, who wouldn't want that? That's exactly what we've been doing for ever since that time. And that's why this is so hard for universities to give up. Because it's basically this wonderful sort of gravy train. You can do whatever you want. The fourth component is that all disciplines are equal. So astrophysics, studying black holes, is the same as semiconductor physics. There's no difference. It's all science. Everything's equal. There's no prioritization. And when you sort of get in the middle of these arguments and these fights over science funding, one of the key things the science community will almost never do is break ranks. They won't throw somebody over the board. They won't throw somebody off, hey, let's get rid of the social sciences and fund it all in physics. Or vice versa. Not going to happen. And the last was this notion, and Nick alluded to that, science is global. We had such a lead. We had all the manufacturing, large share of the manufacturing, that we could talk about science being global because the spillovers, they couldn't do very much with them. What were the Chinese going to do with these spillovers? Nothing. They had no capabilities to do anything with them. And so we would produce all this knowledge, and it would just sort of help the world. And that meant, by definition, that it helped us. So that began to change really in the late 80s and the 90s when the Japanese and German techno-economic challenges arose. We were faced for the first time since World War II with real competitiveness challenge. And so you saw significant reforms, the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act, which was allowing universities to commercialize their own research. Under Reagan, President Reagan and the NSF director, Eric Bloch, you created in NSF things called like the Engineering Research Center Program or the IUCRC, Industry University Research Center Program. So there's now a growing recognition that the science establishment, science and engineering really, should play a stronger role to help US become more competitive. But at the end of the day, that was something that the science community never, in my view, never really accepted. Those programs over at NSF were always sort of they were sort of in the basement. If you ever watch Office Space, the greatest movie of all time, with the red stapler, that was these programs at NSF. They were stuck in the basement. They weren't real science. I'm exaggerating, of course. But if you look at the if you look at the Chips and Science Act, which was the Endless Frontier Act, the science component, the original proposal, and we worked quite closely with Senator Schumer and Senator Young on that. The original proposal was to take 2/3 of the new NSF money and put it into TIP, the Technology and Innovation Partnership, 2/3. And then 1/3 will sort of beef up regular NSF. Well, when you go through the sausage making of Capitol Hill, the science community lobby, and I was in very public debates with some distinguished former advisors to the president on science who said, no, that's wrong. And they were succeeded in making it 2/3 of that money went to regular NSF and 1/3 went to TIP. And then when you go and dig a little deeper into TIP, this is some research we have coming out, we haven't published it yet. Most of it was just sort of regular science. It would have a little thing saying, yes, it's related to industry somehow. So it really, at the end of the day, science community didn't want to go there. And they would talk about how important it is. You would see that with some of the major universities. They would talk about their role in regional economic development and spin-offs and they'd talk about that, which I would if I were them. But with the exception of a handful of universities around the country, maybe 10 or 15, maybe 20. It wasn't what they wanted to do. So 2015, 2016 to the present, let me suggest that period could be called science, DEI, and scandal. Let me talk about DEI first. Science became politicized by the left, and the science community became politicized. The science community started to think of itself in opposition to Trump, in opposition to Republicans. It had never really done that before. So, for example, my son had to do this. I'm not saying this because he did. He's getting his PhD in computer science. He got an NSF fellowship. So I love NSF. It's saved me all this money for him getting his PhD. He had to sign a letter, as did many PhDs, that they would do everything possible to mentor the disadvantaged. University departments openly stated that they were hire based on race and gender. Openly stated that, not on merit. Leading scientists were denied the right to speak at university gatherings because of some sin they had made to their DEI overlords. I'm talking about leading scientists. Faculty were fired for, quote, wrong thing. Colleges and universities became seen as places of indoctrination rather than education and critical sciences. And yeah, that's been going on in social sciences for a long time. We all know that. But what was different this time is it started to spread into the natural sciences. So let me give you a few examples. The National Academy of Sciences started to embrace diversity quotas for who could be a fellow. Never happened before. Science Magazine, quote, writes. Science Magazine, quotes, writes, quote, physics is racist based on white privilege. I don't think physics is racist. Now, you might say, well, there's not enough diverse talent in the physics community. okay, and we should try to do more of that. But to say physics is racist, what the hell? The life sciences department at Berkeley rejected 76% of faculty applicants based upon their DEI statements alone. So they read the DEI statements first before reading the qualifications. And if your DEI statement was not adequate, you lost, you just got kicked out. Now, I have to mention Canada, probably even worse. The University of Waterloo, the Faculty of Environment Science Division, they said, quote, "The position is only open to individuals who self-identify as a woman, as women, transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit." I'm kind of old and I'm not really up on this. I have no clue what two-spirit means. You know, I suppose I could have applied there. I said, I identify as a woman. I could have gotten in. I mean, what in God's name are they thinking? Queen's University research chair in geotechnical engineering, but only if you identify as a woman. McGill said that they were hiring for computer science. And one of the key qualifications they needed for that field, for that position, was background in critical race theory. In 2023, the DOE Office of Science required every proposal to include a promoting inclusive and equitable research part of that. There was a Canadian academic initiative called Decolonizing Light. What planet are we living on? Decolonizing Light, where physics is considered, quote, "a hard and objective science disconnected from social life and geopolitical history. This narrative both constitutes and reproduces inequality." So look, at the end of the day, this is a radical agenda. And the science, I'm not saying everybody in the science community accepted. There are a lot of scientists who are like, man, this stuff's terrible. But they kept their heads down because they didn't want to get attacked. And so the Trump people, they were like, they didn't, oh yeah, we missed all that. The Trump people saw that and they were pissed off. And that's a big, big reason why right now they don't like universities. I'm just telling you, that's what's part of what's going on there. They don't like it. They think that the entire enterprise, including in science, has been radicalized towards an anti-American sort of non-meritocratic agenda. And finally, can't talk about science in the last 8 years without talking about COVID. I mean, talk about a scandal where NIH denied their role in this. They denied what they were funding. They covered up their role. They intentionally covered up the role that the Wuhan lab had in causing this awful pandemic. And the New York Times finally, just last 2 weeks ago, whatever, big article saying, yeah, we were wrong. It's pretty clear it was a COVID lab leak, and it's pretty clear that US science officials lied. Again, that was something the Trump people looked at and did not forget. You can't overestimate that. And I think it was a scandal. I think those people lied, and they lied because they knew that they were responsible. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have done that. I'm not a scientist, and I have no clue. Things happen, I get it. But to lie about it. All right, so where are we now? Now we're in 2025. We're in this new world. For those of you who follow your French Revolution, there's what's called the Thermidor. So, you know, you had Robespierre and all, you know, kill the king, cut off the head of Marie Antoinette, and they just went totally crazy. And then the French are like, yeah, we went too far. So what's called the Thermidorian reaction came in. And that's what we have now. We have the Trump Thermidorian reaction. Yeah, man, the progressive left went way too far, went crazy, got everybody all freaked out. And now, rather than just say to these universities, okay, you know, dismantle a lot of this stuff, stop, and then we'll fund you, they're not going to do that. they're going to punish. This is all about punishment right now. I wish it was not. So, for example, now they mandated under the administration, they mandated that all funded projects for flagged terms such as gender, ethnicity, and systemic racism have to be flagged. This isn't going to go away anytime soon. It'll go away eventually. I'm convinced in 5 years, 4 years, 8 years, eventually it will go away if the far left doesn't keep bringing it back. There's no evidence that the far left wants to abandon this movement, but if they keep pushing it, you're going to keep getting this reaction and we're going to be stuck in this stalemate. I'll talk a little bit about how I think you could fix it. Okay. The second big issue, which would have been a big issue, even if we hadn't had this sort of overreach of, making science woke, saying that science is masculine, saying that science is Western, all this other kind of nonsense. And by the way, just to be clear, I don't mean that we couldn't do more in diversity. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about science itself is what they were saying. And that's the fiscal crisis. We've had this fiscal crisis for a long time, but at some point, as a famous Nixon economic advisor, if something can't go on forever, it won't. And so we're kind of close to that, it won't anymore. So we've had this fiscal crisis for a long time, but the COVID massive spending under Trump and Biden just like blew it out of the water. And now what you have is this sort of convergence of factors, including this, again, this super radical small government administration coming together and saying, okay, everything's on the table now. And before it was like, well, we'll cut a little bit of this, we'll cut a little bit of that. But now, no, everything's on the table. And I mean that. You just saw that Pete Hegseth talked about cutting $50 billion from the defense budget or something like that. Whoa. It used to be for Republicans, everything was on the table except tax cuts and defense spending. That was always sacrosanct. Not anymore. So it's important to recognize that this is a problem that would be here no matter what, because you're seeing the same dynamic now in Europe, where European officials are cutting science spending because there's just no headroom anymore. The baby boomers are sucking up all the money, especially in Europe, where you usually retire at a really young age. And people who retire take money, they don't make money for society, and you got to pay them. And that puts this fiscal pressure on budgets, and science in Europe is being threatened by that. And the same thing is true in the US. I sort of have to laugh when I hear Musk say anything. But clearly, when Musk says, I'm going to balance the budget without cutting Medicare and Social Security, you're on ketamine, clearly. I mean, you just cannot balance the US budget without, number one, raising taxes, and number two, cutting entitlements. Cannot be done. Which sort of gives you a clue as to what the real agenda here. The budget crisis is partly being used as a ploy to get to the pre-1913 government. It's a ploy to get to a government that's radically smaller. So all of their talk about, the swamp and all of this stuff, unelected bureaucrats, that's all a way of saying, let's just make Washington a lot smaller. As Grover Norquist once said, my goal is to shrink Washington into what did he say? Something that I can drown in a bathtub. That's what they want to do. Why this is important with regard to science, and Nick mentioned this point that the private sector has increased their science spending, which is great, fantastic. By the way, the biggest spenders or investors, the biggest by far, are the large technology companies. If you look at Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Google, they spend more on science every year than the entire UK science budget. I mean, they are spending an enormous amount of money, along with semiconductors and biopharmaceuticals. But what the conservative libertarians have convinced themselves, so if your whole worldview, you wake up in the morning, you think you don't need government, you got to come up with something. Well, what about science? Well, they've come up with that. And so if you read Project 2025, the Heritage thing, which was the guidebook for the Trump administration, mandate for leadership, the conservative promise, they say, quote, we want to dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. But they then go on, and at Heritage and other places, that science spending is the same as home heating subsidies. Just doesn't matter. And the wonderful sort of trick they've made, which is great, which is that Heritage says, quote, by attempting to force government-developed technologies into the market, the government diminishes the role of the entrepreneur and, quote, crowds out private sector investment. The conservative Mercatus Center at George Mason, sort of a libertarian group, quote, government crowds out R&D. Government R&D crowds out more efficient private sector research spending. If anything, the fall of federal R&D should be good for technical progress. So this is like, if I want to rationalize eating hamburgers and drinking scotch every day, I'm going to find some study that says eating hamburgers turns out it reduces your cholesterol. Oh, this is great. That's the rationale they have. Now, we at ITF and many others have looked at all of the literature. And I could just go on and on and on. The World Bank, the OECD, all sorts of literature. And it basically says, no, you're wrong. For every dollar of federal R&D, on average, it induces about 30 cents of private sector additionality. So it's not substitutive, it's additive. Very good study by two academics, Cockburn and Henderson, concluded, after reviewing all the econometric studies, quote, they make a convincing case for high rate of return of public science. There are, as far as we are aware, no systematic quantitative studies that have found the negative impact of public science on overall science spending. So that's the reality. Now, your job is to go and talk to libertarians and tell them that they're crazy. Tell them that these are ideological statements that they're making. Now, does that mean that all science is equal? No, of course not. But on average, that's what they're saying. Okay, so what do we do now? Number one, I don't think having a demonstration on the wall or having a demonstration up at NIH makes any difference. I just don't think so. It's just, unless you get the mass of America focused on this, which they're not going to be, the opponents will just look at that and go, special interests, special interests. So I think there's some tough choices that have to be made. And the first one is renounce the DEI-ness of science. Just renounce it. Just say we're not doing it anymore. So this is what Georgia Tech has done. Now, Georgia Tech did it partly because they're in a Republican state and they had a governor and a legislature that told them they should do it, but they did it. I think university presidents have to just say, yeah, we went too far. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going back to science for science, and we apologize. Is that going to happen? No way that's going to happen. Just no way. But related to that is academics have to stop being so emotional. I can't tell you the number of academics I've talked to, scientists, who are like, they hate Trump. I don't care if you hate Trump. Fine, hate him. Don't vote for him. But this is business. This is not politics. The science enterprise in the US is business. Leave those aside. They have played no role in this. The science community's role is a simple one. Get more support for science and engineering and do more and better science and engineering. It's not to change the world. It's not to get Democrats elected. Now, if you want to do that, feel free. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it or you can't do it. I'm just saying recognize that in the incredibly politically divisive world we're in, that is going to have consequences. There will be costs to that statement, to that position. I mean, maybe the Democrats will win in 28. But imagine a world now in 28 where science funding has been cut 25%. You think that they're going to go up another 25% just because the Democrats are in control? No, no way. This is a one-way ratchet. Might go up 5%, might go up 8%, but it's not going to go back up 25%. So the idea that you can sort of wait this out, I think, is faulty. The second is alluded to my original point, is really reject Bushism and really begin to think about the alignment between science and the national interest very explicitly, not, well, it sort of happens by this magic linear process. And I think that means making a grand new bargain with regard to science. You know, when Bush talked about all this linear stuff, at the end of the day, the science community was not Bushian. It was not linear. It was all about a mission. Very little of US science funding was at NSF. Almost all of it was at DOD and then DOE and NASA. It was about a mission. It was about beating the Soviets. We were going to enlist our scientific and engineering resources to beat the Soviets. We talked a good game. We talked, oh, well, you know, no, that's what we did. And everybody knew it. And I think what we've got to do now is basically get back to that and say, it's time to beat the Chinese communists. We've written extensively about that. You can agree or not agree. In our view, the Chinese have set a goal to not just gain global market share, but to dominate every advanced industry in the world. Every advanced industry, biotechnology, AI, aerospace, quantum computing, you name it, I mentioned aerospace, you name it. They have made a goal to beat us, to destroy us. And that means that one of the ways we're going to have to deal with that is by funding more science and engineering and having it be related to these missions. So more AI so that we can win the AI race, more quantum so we can win the quantum race, more biotech so we can win the biotech race, et cetera, et cetera. But that has to be done with a recognition that it's not just enough to write articles, which the Chinese read. The Chinese just developed a system, I can't remember the name of it, I wrote about a year ago, everybody's talking about this massive sort of global vacuum cleaner of science information. Everything gets collected, put into China. So it can't just be about producing science. It has to be about linking to US entrepreneurs and industries. The third thing I think would be to reject this sort of idolatry of academic freedom. So the Scientific American recently wrote about Trump. This threatens not only scientific progress, but the very foundation of academic freedom. Look, the reality is you don't have academic freedom. If you wanted to write an article saying that Adolf Hitler was the greatest thing since sliced bread, you don't have really had the academic freedom to do that. In my view, you shouldn't have the academic freedom to do that. And secondly, if you work for a government-funded institution, you have to sort of comply with what the norms and expectations of the US public are. And so to just simply sort of use that as an excuse to say, well, we can do whatever the hell we want. Again, you can, but there will be consequences to that. And the last point is do a much better job of articulating how science and engineering advancements lead to real world benefits. You know, I have a little hobby, which is I get all these news clips about this. I often see it in clean energy, which I follow a little bit more just because, but I'll see this thing and it'll say, University X scientist just came out with this breakthrough. Whoa, that's so cool. I wonder who funded it. Nothing. University press office doesn't list anything. So I go online, I look at, oh, it was funded by DOE, or oh, it was funded by the Office of Naval Research. I have yet to see a university press release list the fact that they were funded by the federal government. And I think that I understand why they do it, blah, blah, blah. But I think the whole community needs to come together and really make it so clear that this doesn't happen without robust federal support, and highlight it every single second that you get the opportunity to do. So let me stop by saying again, I'll reiterate, don't be partisan. Science community should not be partisan. Republicans are people, Democrats are people. Republicans, there are many, many Republicans in the House and the Senate that want to fund science. If you saw that op-ed by Todd Young and Matt Pottinger, I guess it was 2 days ago, I think it was in the New York Times, perhaps. Todd Young, Republican from Indiana, Pottinger, Trump, NSC guy. So in closing, I wish the environment were better. I wish it was like this new world, wonderful open road. We're going to mobilize science and engineering to beat the Chinese, to maintain American leadership, to solve major problems of health and environment, et cetera. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think if we're going to get there, it means recognizing that the community itself has to make some changes, that it just can't be blaming Trump and the Republicans. There's a lot to blame there, don't get me wrong. But I think if that's all that happens, you're just in a stalemate. So I will stop there. Nick, you said I could say whatever I wanted, so.
Thank you. This community needs to listen to. You want to.
Oh, we're doing questions, not students.
Shall we do this? Students, right? No, students. Let's invite.
Great.
Annie Goodman from DW.
Recently Goodman Miller, by the way, hyphenated, and I keep forgetting to say that, and I promised my wife I would. So, thank you. So I'm in my last semester here, getting a master's from the International Science and Technology Policy Program, focusing on applications of emerging technologies in WMD security. I've been an intern at Sandia National Labs for about 3 years now, in the DOE complex, and then at STRATCOM before that. I'd like to pause, do my disclaimer timeout here. I do not speak on behalf of Sandia. I do not speak on behalf of GW. Nobody has ordained me with that. So my opinions are my own. My statement is my own, and onwards and upwards. Dr. Atkinson, I appreciate you challenging some of our perceptions today. It's definitely important to hear from diverse voices. I actually come out of Nebraska, the University of Nebraska system. So I'm very, very familiar and very, very at home with some conservative opinions and not with others. And I appreciate you bringing some perspectives. I would like to say a few things though, if you'll permit me. Number one, if we're basing science research funding on decisions of the athletics department, that's patently absurd. Ignoring the fact that transgender people have rights or whatever. Before the athlete ban in the NCAA, there were 10 out of 500,000 NCAA athletes that were transgender. And that's on behalf of the chairman of the NCAA. So if we're basing retribution policies on science funding for universities based on what their athletics department does, it's a fascinating choice, to say the least. I'll say that. I don't know why athletics has anything to do with science funding and why that matters. On beyond that, I have a few thoughts on the state of how the policy changes are going to affect students like myself, young professionals going into the workforce potentially for the first time, and also about students from the Elliott School who are in a little bit more unique of a situation, where they are already professionals, already in their jobs, and then sort of progressing, getting promotions, transitioning to new positions as they advance their education. I can definitely say from a student perspective, this year's topic is especially grim. Changes in science policy are going to affect us in a way that classes before us have not faced, and massive funding cuts and the indiscriminate firings of predominantly young professionals from the US government have really rocked a lot of what our plans have been. Some students have already been laid off from their existing jobs. Other students are struggling to find postgraduate employment at all. And we're systematically eliminating pipelines for young professionals to come into the government, like the Presidential Management Fellows Program, which was removed in whole about a month ago. On top of that, the students coming out of the Elliott School are competing with displaced workers for the jobs that are available. The private sector can only absorb so many of these jobs, so many of these positions. And I think it's really important to recognize that while industry does fund a really significant amount of science research, science, technology, research, and development, that not all of those jobs, not all of the open positions are going to fit everybody coming out of the government, and that competition pool has massively increased. I've also seen recently the changes at the Elliott School, right? We've shifted. We were hosting career fairs about pivoting to the private sector. These are students who have spent potentially their entire academic careers aiming for a job in the public sector, going into the civil service, and are now changing their entire direction based on these policies. I agree, certainly, that it's a critical time to compete in things like biotechnology, AI, semiconductor manufacturing, and among many, many other places. But I really worry about these entry-level jobs, these pipelines to employment, being lost. And we're not bringing in the talent then. The talent is being either sent to the private sector or wasted entirely. It's something that tremendously concerns me because the US has been on the cutting edge for so long, that we've been at a competition level with China, that we've been fighting or winning this race. And now we are stopping that in service of a different agenda. There are agendas that are problematic on all sides. I'm never going to say there aren't. But the radical cuts to the government pose real challenges for America's competitiveness today and tomorrow. The Canadians who we've invited here today to join us are taking this opportunity, along with Europeans and many others, to strategically build up their own strengths in science and technology, healthcare, and public policy, among other areas. They are actually, the Canadians just announced a scheme to bring US healthcare workers who feel alienated or who aren't able to find jobs in the United States. The Canadian military is also working with the EU and among other countries to reduce its reliance on US defense technology. So the US defense industrial base is not safe. As you said, the things are changing. I mean, the sacrosanct, I think is the word to use, defense has always been safe. Defense and national security have always been a priority. And that has changed. Losing people and cash flow in the defense industrial base, while also reducing the size of the overall defense budget, can and will cripple the US's ability to meet the emerging threats and challenges of tomorrow. And as I said before, private industry can only absorb so much. The graduating classes of this semester and many future semesters will struggle to keep up and to find jobs and to remain in this sector. The US government is right now tearing down, defunding, and crippling our vast science and technology capabilities in the moment when we need them the most and when we need to be expanding them rapidly. I do want to end this on a positive note. I'm not going to talk forever. And I would like to provide just a touch of optimism if I can. In these bleak times where especially the US-Canada relationship is strained, our longtime friend and ally has been pushed aside, snubbed, pick your verb there. We here at this lecture, the team from GW, the team from U Ottawa, prove that as students and faculty and university members writ large are committed to building these international relationships, to maintaining them, and to making sure that the international community is able to continue to work together on some of these really pressing challenges as they grow. Community and friendship and collegial relationships will persevere despite any of the changes that we're going to see coming up here shortly. That is all I have. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? So yeah, thank you, Dr. Atkinson, for your speech, and thank you, Annie, as well. My name is Grace McGrenery. I'm currently pursuing a Master's in Environmental Sustainability at the University of Ottawa. And I'm delighted to speak on a topic that is not only timely, but necessary as we move toward a new era of science that is predicated on trust, values, and collaboration. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the things that were talked in Dr. Atkinson's presentation today with a little bit of a different perspective, which I think is important as we're renegotiating this new era of science. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral lands of the Nunkachick people and the Pescataqua people. While we speak of advancements in nation building, it must not be forgotten that Indigenous knowledge has and continues to be excluded from decision-making processes, and it's imperative to incorporate Indigenous science into governance frameworks. So I'm going to be talking about the post-war social contract. And it does not currently reflect Canada's realities, much like the US, like we talked about. The US post-war social contract inspired Canadian science, technology, and innovation. Since 1945, when the social contract was first introduced, society has witnessed significant advances in science, technology, and innovation. Yet the vision for science has not changed to reflect these advancements. Canada has the opportunity to redefine and inspire its own scientific identity as it moves away from its post-war foundations. Although this new ideology will depart from a US-inspired notion of science, it does not mean that Canada and the US will no longer collaborate. Just like Canada, the US must search for a new way to conduct science. Together, the two countries can build upon each other's visions to strengthen and improve their scientific relations and projects. So where does that leave us? The words I'm about to read to you are not traditionally recognized as scientific, and yet, to me, they are just as important when envisioning a new scientific enterprise. Trust, values, communication, respect, accountability, and transparency. These are characteristics one might think about when envisioning a relationship. Science and society have a relationship that is meant to be mutually beneficial, but is currently strained due to the belief that science must remain autonomous from society. This boundary work hinders the success of the scientific enterprise and subsequently science for policy and policy for science. The power dynamics must shift to recognize that science is inherently value-laden and political. Science must stand as a part of society, not stand apart from society. It influences decision-making, which in turn affects the public. Post-war social contract notions of universalism, communalism, and repeatability do not account for the diverse perspectives and priorities of the Canadian people of today, nor do they reflect science's inherent curiosity. If science does not represent the communities and cultures it serves, society will not reap its benefits. To improve the relationship between Canadians and science, trust must be reinstated between the two, recognizing that science is an uncertain and imperfect process. Policymakers must make value judgments when clear decisions cannot be made by science alone, because science is not a substitute for value judgments. These value judgments should also be informed by knowledge and cultural systems that have not traditionally been privileged by Western society, like Indigenous science, as well as other interdisciplinary sciences. A decolonial and interdisciplinary approach to science will see a change in how science identifies priorities, collects and evaluates evidence, and allocates research funds. To assist in this transition and make science more accessible, scientists must take on the responsibility of communicating their findings and processes in a meaningful way. This includes clearly stating their philosophies alongside their findings. For Canadians to benefit from science, they must be involved in its process. A relationship is a partnership. It requires trust, values, communication, respect, accountability, and transparency. Without these attributes, it cannot be mutually beneficial. Perhaps we must depart from the belief that science should or should not be something. Framing science in this light has led to restrictive and exclusionary knowledge systems. While Western science traditionally favors binaries and boundaries, science should be adaptive and fluid, and reflecting its uncertain and evolving nature. With that being said, it's not unfathomable to imagine that the next period of science may not be defined by a social contract. However, it can continue to provide benefits to society, provided that its approaches reflect and continuously reflect the evolving values of all Canadians. Thank you for listening.
Point of discussion. This being a university, we need to debate stuff here. We heard some provocative statements. We need to talk about it. So let me start with one, Rob, if I may. So there is this academic writer from, she is working at the University College London, Mrs. Matsukato, I'm referring to. So Mariana, who is a very, very well-known thinker, international, she advises many governments, goes around and presents this idea that reminded me of one of the points that you mentioned, the mission. So scientists need to actually connect to the missions of the country. So she presents this magnificent set of graphics that show things like, here is the iPhone, and these are the pieces of research that made the iPhone possible, right? That were funded by the government. Correctly. These are all correct. This is correct information. Now I ask the question, before the fact, after the fact, this is absolutely true. Now, before the fact, did we know what actually will go into the iPhone? And how could the government target and direct the scientists to produce that research that will end up in this magnificent product? So this is a question that we have always met in science policy. Can we actually target? Or we need to fund broadly and let 1,000 flowers bloom?
Okay, so I should respond very quickly to our two respondents. The first young woman said that it's absurd to cut off Penn funding because there was some guy. Yeah, I agree. I don't think anybody's saying it's not absurd. But it's irrelevant whether it's absurd or not. It's just irrelevant. It's the world that we're in right now. So you either deal with that world or you don't. I don't think it's right. I think most of what they're doing in that is punishment. It's wrong. But you have to understand, so again, you have to move beyond sort of righteous indignation. This is about political reality. So if you spend a lot of time in Washington, lobbyists don't think about things like being absurd or being hanging. Lobbyists, it's just one thing. Can I get what I want done? That's all it is. And I think we have to approach the science establishment like that. Science and engineering are too important to our future to not do it in a very surgical, cold-hearted way. You mentioned radical cuts are bad. Oh, no other think tank but us, except who've been arguing for massive increases in science funding. $100 billion we've argued for. So yeah, I agree. But I think we have to do a better job of explaining why. And then my colleague from Canada, I think we're just going to disagree on that one. But I think what's important is to have a debate about what are the consequences of going down that path, pro and con. With regard to Mazzucato, I don't know, I'm going to sound petty. I probably am petty here. Look, all that mission-oriented stuff, that was all done by the National Academy of Sciences before her. She just copied it. But yeah, sure. Marianne's point, Marianne is not somebody who wants more innovation. I debated her once and I said, you know what we need to do? We need to increase federal R&D by $1 gazillion and we need to double the R&D tax credit. So I'm agnostic, okay? I want to do both. She said, no, I don't want to increase the R&D tax credit. That just gives money to companies. So that's a left-wing ideological statement because every single econometric, good economic study of the R&D credit shows, including in Canada, it shows you get between $1.30 and $2 of increased private sector R&D for every dollar of tax expenditure you get. So it's a tool. just like federal funding is a tool. And anyway, that's my complaint about Marianne. Is when she talks about missions, what she really wants to do is she wants to move science into a social policy enterprise. And I don't think that's where it belongs. I think it belongs in.
So basically, you and I agree.
Yeah,
The answer is that you and I agree. She has an issue, problem.
yeah.
After the fact, you can show this. Before the fact, you can't.
That was the other point, Nick, which I should have mentioned. Look, you know, the great commercial, you know, Miller Lite is less filling as it tastes great. Yeah, it is both. Okay. So you have to do both. I would be the last person to argue we should take away sort of PI-driven serendipitous research funding. That would be awful, just awful. You can't do that. But it doesn't have to be all of that. I think there needs to be a share that's saying, you know, look, if we just did a little exercise here, we all sort of pick the top 20 scientific fields, areas. Optics would be one. We would all come up with maybe 30, and it wouldn't be that hard to do. We all know AI research, including explainability, is going to be super important for the future. So we're going to fund that. Now, there's a guy up at Northeastern where my son's getting his PhD who has a particular approach to that. Should that be the approach? I don't know. Probably we wouldn't know enough to say that, but we do know enough to say that AI and explainability is something really important that we need to fund American computer science researchers to do. Same thing with new materials. So I don't think it's black or white, Nick. I guess you got to do both.
Okay, the floor is open. Identify your.
Hi, I'm Evelina Chantakala from the German Embassy, Science Counselor there. Thank you very much for all your talks. Very interesting to have an overview also of US science history. I have two questions. The first one relates to university and the cuts they are currently confronted with. Would you agree, or would you say that Columbia University is now the one doing the right things? With, I mean, they are cutting down on DEI, they are increasing, or they are also cutting down somehow on freedom of speech on campus, increasing security there and so on, in reaction to the 400 million cuts. Is this the right way to go for universities? I mean, others are struggling or like trying to find a way. And the second question relates to the consequences of these cuts on a global level. I mean, you mentioned something like it will diminish the power, the possibility of the US to be technologically and so on at the forefront. What would you advise European governments to do in that situation?
Sure. All right, let me do the latter one first. You know, 25 years ago, Singapore decided they wanted to establish this biopolis. They had nothing. And people mocked it. A lot of people mocked it. It was not going to work. It worked pretty darn well. I mean, it was amazing. And the key for them was, we're going to hand out basically really, really good research fellowships. You have your own lab, you know, a graduate student will pay you a lot of money, and they just bought great talent. I think that's what Europe should do. I hate to say that because I'm an American, Canadian, and Canada should do that too. But, you know, in some way, it'd be a good message for Trump. You know, hey, you want to do this stuff? Fine, fine. Our best scientists are going to be recruited by countries who understand and appreciate science. Now, you know, you're on your own domestic politics and all that stuff. Every country does it. But I do think that, you know, the French just came out and said something along those lines. I think that's a really, really smart thing to do. Look, if we're in a rational world, we would have a joint U.S., well, OECD, but US, Europe, Japan, Korea, joint science and engineering initiatives and joint funding. And we were kind of moving in that direction under Biden. We're under framework programs and all. We should be going deep down that path, in my view. But that's not going to happen for 4 more years. On the Columbia thing, like, I'm not an expert on it, but I think there's 2 things going on there. There's the, so I really am not an expert on it. There's the Columbia thing is, first of all, there's a little bit of disingenuousness going on at universities where they're saying, oh yeah, we want free speech. We want these kids to be able to say, you know, Palestine's great and Israel's bad. You know, fine, whatever. I agree with that's free speech. You ought to be able to say that regardless of what we think. They didn't have that view when it came to other issues that were more on the liberal side, where students were pushing back against the other. There was a clampdown on free speech among universities if you were saying conservative voices. So they can't really come now and say, oh yeah, but we're for free speech. Come on, you weren't evenly for free speech. Just admit that. So I don't know what, I don't know what, if I were Columbia, I just heard a little podcast with the former president of Columbia, whatever his name is, where he says they're going to sue the government. They might win, but I think that's a terrible idea. You want to do basically what Zuckerberg and Google did, and all that. You go to the swearing in ceremony. You say, Trump, we love you. You go down to Key Largo. You just have to do that. I'm sorry, that's the reality. You just have to say, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just not doing it anymore. We're going to go back to sort of straight up science and thing. And we really like you doing this one thing. I'll give you an example. I was talking to somebody, some university. They asked me, they were going to file something on AI, the administration, OSTP, who, by the way, I really like Mike Kratzios. I think he'll be a very good OSTP director. They had an AI, Lynn Parker had an AI thing, what do we need to do? And so they asked me, what should we say and all that stuff? You've written these and, we don't really understand Washington. I said, well, the first thing you say is, thank you, President Trump, for leading this initiative to get America back in the lead on AI. And they're like, well, I'm not sure our faculty members would like that. Come on. I mean, that my point is, you don't have to like Trump. You can think he's Hitler, but it's business. It's all it is business. And so if you want to get more money for AI, you send in a thing to Lynn Parker and OSTP and you say, thank you, President Trump, for your leadership on AI. And thank you, Vice President Vance, for your speech over in Paris or wherever it was. And here's why we want to do what we do. So I just think they got to tone the politics down. That would be my advice to them.
We have a question.
So first off, thank you, Dr. Atkinson, for your remarks. I appreciate that you came here for a debate, and I'm going to give you one. I guess I would say I was pretty excited about this talk because I completely agree with the premise of it. I think that old models are not working. We need to rethink how we do science and technology policy. But I've got to say that after listening to your talk, to me, it sounds like the way that you think we need to rethink doing science and technology policy is we should stop taking positions on issues that are viewed as partisan. And also we should stop taking positions on issues that are viewed as partisan. And also we should suck up to Trump, which I gather is not something you would view as partisan behavior.
First of all, let's be 100% clear. I'm not telling the science community what they should do. I'm just saying, if you keep taking positions that are seen as progressive and liberal, there will be cost to that. So most of what, again, I have to differentiate between sort of natural sciences, other thing, but if the Trumpians look at the science community as part of the opposition. I'm just saying, that's how they look at the science community. They're part of the opposition. The media is part of the opposition. The universities are part of the opposition. Big tech is part of the opposition. So how do you want to deal with that? You tell me. Now, if you want to keep sort of, no, I'm just telling you, if you want to keep doing that, go ahead. My point is that there will be cost, that they will continue to look at the science establishment as the opposition, and therefore they will do everything possible to shrink it and cut it. I don't think that's appropriate anyway to do that. I think, first of all, as individuals, maybe you can say that, it's good to sign the climate accord. By the way, my own view, just to be clear on that, again, we've probably done more on climate innovation policy than any think tank. We were helping creating ARPA-E. We've just been all over that. I don't think it makes one bit of difference whether they were in the climate accord or not. Zero. The whole thing was meaningless. It was all about speech. I'll give you an example. We proposed a an idea which ended up getting placed. It was called Mission Innovation. A bunch of the countries got together and they said, let's double our clean energy innovation investments over 5 years. Yeah, exactly. You know how many countries doubled? 1. We were number 2. So we do more, by the way. Just again, to me, this is, I'm not saying this because this is great, or we should have some objectivity. The US does more to fight climate change than any other country in the world, because we fund more on clean energy R&D than any other country in the world by far. So we should acknowledge that. That's my only point. And yeah. I think it's a mistake. That's the other thing. I do think it's a mistake I think absolutely you should say you're working on climate, but the way to say it is not, well, we're going to sign some plaza. You know, there were European governments, not the Germans, European governments that after 5 years were spending less on clean energy innovation R&D than before that. And they were the first to ride their bicycle. The minister would ride her bicycle to the plaza, to the big meeting, the COP meeting, ride her bicycle. Oh, look, come on. So what was your second point? I'm sorry. Okay. So again, just saying, the reason I may be so strong about this, I think it would be, I have 2 kids, and I think their life is going to be way worse relative to what it could be if we don't figure this out and get, at minimum, no cuts in inflation-adjusted dollars to science, but ideally, you know, continued increases that at least match GDP. If we don't do that, the world's going to not be a good place. America's not going to be as good a place. I'm willing to do almost anything to get that. I'm willing to say that the Trump is, thank you for doing this, Mr. Trump. I'm willing to not have my views come out on particular political, who cares what my views are? And that's why I'm so adamant about this. This shouldn't be about our own personal views. It shouldn't be about changing society. It should be about building up the science and engineering enterprise, in my view.
Some people in the room know that I have a big thing going on in Brazil. This is for many years. This kind of discussion is deja vu. This exactly debate with the same words were fought with a sort of Lava Jato kind of Lava Jato means the wash car scandals, the big scandals down there, and President Bolsonaro came in after a significant turmoil, and he thought really that the universities are against him and that the press is against him. So he went down the path to destroy them, destroy the press and destroy the universities. Major universities, the University of São Paulo, the Federal University of São Paulo, which is one of the top 3 in the country, reached the point where they could not cover their electricity bills to have a class, to hold a class. This is real. That country dealt with the situation. I don't know for how long, but it dealt with it, right? But it had to go to a very deep soul searching about what are we here for, right? So thank you.
I would just add, by the way, I think we have to assume that is the world we're going to live in going forward. Right? We're not going to go back to, quote, normal politics. We're living in a banana republic. We're going to have very, very sharp right to left switches the way Latin America has for a long time. And so you got to live in that world that things could change 180 degrees.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What can be done to get things more on the merits and have program appraisal methodologies that will emphasize how the science being proposed fits in with accomplishing things and its track record for being adopted by industry and making useful things?
Well, Bob, there's a couple of things there. One, I mean, there are people doing really interesting work on sort of the science of science policy and, should you do randomized thing, and that's all cool work, and I'm not aware enough of an expert on it to comment on it. But we should certainly experiment more, I think, in terms of how we fund things, take bigger risk. I think that's a really important thing to do. I'm going to contradict myself, though, by saying I really think that what we need to do, particularly NSF, is they need to make sure that there's more geographical diversity in science funding. If you looked at what this thing was called, the Regional Innovation Hub, that was our idea. And the idea was to get more top-notch research universities in the heartland. Why? Because you build more political consensus, build more political support if you have strong research in Iowa and Mississippi and all these other places, and it's not just at the top places. So you can do that without diminishing quality. So I think that's something to do. In terms of industry, I think it's frankly pretty straightforward, which is we could start to evaluate funding for universities based upon how much they work with industry. This is something we've recommended in Canada, where Canada's problem is even worse than ours, because 40% of their research is university research. And there's this long sort of struggle, and why aren't we getting more benefits of it? Because there's no incentive inherently for Canadian universities to commercialize that in Canada. If you gave them incentives, we could do that. That's what the Swedes and the Finns do a little bit. So I'm not saying it should be everything, but certainly at the margin, you could give bonuses to universities that do a much better job of working with industry. You look around the country, and there are some universities that are great, like University of Utah, and then there are some that are awful, like Columbia. No reason you should have awful ones. It's not a mystery. It's easy to figure this stuff out, how to do it. It's just some universities just don't really want to do it.
Okay. Yeah, so as I spoke earlier, I think that science, is value laden, and I was curious as to why you think the opposite, why science isn't value laden or political. I'll give the example of funding. When we choose where to fund things, there's inherently values in that. So I was curious as to why you think science is not value laden or shouldn't be political, because when I think about funding, we choose where to fund things based on values. And, the entire talk has been focused on politics as well in relation to science. So it's not too separate from what I can, infer from your talk. And you've also talked about some of your own values throughout the talk and how that's kind of infused in science. So I'm just wondering, is your position on that?
I just think it's way less than the sort of the science policy world thinks it is. Let me put it this way: if you're in the realm of democratic capitalist system that we have, then I don't think it's very values oriented. Now, if you want to start saying, well, we don't like that system and we want to really move outside of that, sure, then it's value system. But I don't think there's very many values related to figuring out how quantum computing is going to go to the next level. It's not a values thing. It's just an engineering science thing. Same thing with biotech. Same thing with almost everything. Same thing with how do we figure out how to get storage batteries that are 10 times cheaper. It's just now the question is, how do you manage those things? Are there regulations you need? Are there ways where you think about the adoption of those might be related to values that are important? Absolutely. I'm not saying that the upstream or the downstream doesn't have values that are important to think about, but the pure production, I don't think it really does have much at all. And I'm sure there's going to be certain disciplines, where, like, I'll give you, again, not my area, but, historically, there wasn't maybe as much focus on AIDS research at the beginning, or maybe there wasn't as much focus on sickle cell anemia. Well, those are sort of societal value choices that get represented there. But I think the answer there is we should have a social discussion and a social dialogue about what gets funded. My only point is, I don't think a lot of people, when they say that, they mean, yeah, but we don't mean Trump supporters. I don't know, we're talking real democracy. Trump supporters voted for the guy. So I don't think you got to take that seriously. These are real voters. They weren't forced to do this. They made choices. We got to understand why they made those choices. So anyway, I don't think it's as big a deal as I think most of what we want to fund is just pure. We got to figure out how to make hypersonic weapons. Now, is that a value because we want weapons? I don't think it's a value. I think it's reality. Chinese have better hypersonic weapons than we do. Do we want to live in a world where they have better hypersonic weapons? I do not.
Hi, Andrew Basham, recent graduate from the GW program, and this is less about the hard science and more about the political climate that we're in. You discussed some of the recent events in terms of like a backlash against the left by the right. It's in control now. But do you think these terms still help us understand what's happening, or is this really more of a populist surge on both sides against the elite? And just look, anti-vax used to be a hippy dippy liberal thing. Raw milk was a far left thing, and overnight this is swapped. So does left, right, liberal, conservative really help, or is this populist versus the elite? And if that's true, doesn't the scientific community being flush with federal money make you by definition the political elite and a target of that?
I agree with that. But I don't think this is like if you go back to the 1890s and the rise of the populist movement. I don't think it's quite that same kind of thing, because it's much more related to, it's much less related to class and much more related to the culture wars. There are all these people who want, the Trump supporters lost their jobs or something. Yeah, come on. You look at the polling, the Trump supporters on average have slightly higher incomes. And it wasn't that. It's really about a culture war. And then you go back to, well, it's partly about the elites. If you look at the record of elites in the US over the last 30 years, it's pretty dismal. I mean, really, they screwed up massively on so many occasions. Like, why don't we invade Iraq? What could possibly go wrong? And we're talking mass swaths of the elite who said, yeah, let's go invade Iraq. Let's free them. They'll become democratic. I mean, I'm not talking about a small group of neocons. And that was a mass group of elites in Washington. 6 months before the financial collapse in 2008, you had the Boston Fed saying the odds of a nationwide housing collapse are 0. Letting China join the WTO, what could possibly go wrong? They were going to become like us. So I do think that the elites don't have a strong track record. They've made many, many, many mistakes. And what's worse is they don't, with the exception of a few, they don't apologize. The elite system in Washington is such that once you become an elite, you don't apologize. You circle the wagons and everybody defends you. And I think we'll look back on history and we'll say, the elites, and if you go back and look at our elites pre-1998, maybe 1990s, they were not a perfect group of elites. And they made mistakes, there's no question about it. But overall, there was a sense of kind of discipline among the elites. The elites disciplined themselves. They don't discipline themselves. They circle the wagons, they cover each other's ass, they protect each other at all costs. And people are rightly upset about that. And the problem is that Trump is the ultimate in the anti-elite. Trump is the anti-elite, which is why he's done so well. He's like, he makes fun of these people, and they're easy to make fun of because they've screwed up so badly. So how's that going to get solved? I don't think it gets solved until perhaps you guys all go out and become elites and decide you're going to be good elites and not corrupt elites is maybe too strong a term, but close to that, I would say.
Thanks so much, Chelsea Hahn, also GWISTP. You mentioned manufacturing, and former Loan Programs Office at DOE, Jigar Shah, recently said the business model of innovation in this country has been innovate here and manufacture on some other continent. And in my experience, there's nothing harder as an engineer, as a material scientist, there's nothing harder than trying to bridge that gap. One might call it the valley of death between an innovation in the lab and the university to a commercialized product. And I came from engineering programs that very much promoted entrepreneurship and working with industry, and they pushed us to patent at University of Michigan and Delaware. How does your post-Vannevar Bush framework fit with the fact that we've lost a significant amount of our innovation ecosystems when we've lost manufacturing, and do you agree with that?
100% agree with that. 100% agree with that. The best work on that to me is Willie Shih and Gary Pisano at Harvard Business School, who've written extensively about sort of the decline of the U.S. industrial commons and the effect on innovation. There's also a very good study they have where they have a matrix, and I don't remember what each axis is, but they basically divide up all the major industries into these four axes, four parts. And there's one axis where you don't need to be close. And that's sort of, we think everything's in that axis. You can separate it out and you're still going to, but there's other axes where you have to be close. Look, the reality is we've made some progress. I mean, Obama put in place some good programs. You have NSF, TechCore, you have SBIR. The problem with SBIR is it's not only tiny, but the majority of the funding goes to SBIR mills. That's just their business model. So we don't really have a serious national program around going over the first and second valleys of death. We just don't. There have been some initiatives on the Hill. Actually, I give Senator Marco Rubio, when he was in the Senate, a lot of credit. He had a bill that would have moved us along. Very interesting bill. In typical fashion, these things die oftentimes. But I absolutely agree. It's not just about funding science. You have to figure out this path to get commercialization in the U.S. And some universities are good, some federal labs are good. A lot of federal labs aren't good, and there's no priority. In DOE they have a thing called the PEMP, Performance Something Management Plan. There's 10 factors that labs are evaluated on. One of those has so now they get 10. Number 6 has 6 things, and one of those is commercialization. So you're a manager of a lab, you're like, I'm not going to focus on that one. I'm going to focus on the ones that really matter for me to get my high grade. And so we just don't make it a priority because we think it's magic. We think it's just going to happen. And the reality is it does happen. I mean, you look at A123, MIT, great innovation. It got commercialized in China. So the Chinese do not have that problem.
So it's going to be the last question, I guess, right? Thank you, Rap, for your remarks. So my question is going to be, because we mainly talk about the internal politics and more US, SDI, how it's going to really evolve, but how about the international and global, consequences of this? I think what we are talking is about the trust on science is also kind of, right now it's questioning, how we are going to trust the scientists, or the collaboration. So how do you see the collaborations of the other like-minded countries, in the world, not only with Europe, but also the others? How this, especially short-term and the recent policies will affect these collaborations and competitors of this SDI policies?
So there are clearly things that, complete global partnerships make sense. So studying black holes, we work with the Chinese on that or whatever, maybe infectious diseases, although trust them on one. But sure, there can be some things in science where it makes sense to just try to build global partnerships. So I think most of it's going to have to be basically a Cold War mentality where democratic allied countries are going to have to work much more closely together in the science, technology, and engineering realms to Like I just saw this thing where the Europeans want to like build up their semiconductor firms. I'm like, are you kidding me? Please don't waste your money. We're the ones who know how to do that. The Koreans and the Taiwanese. Don't bother to reinvent the wheel. You're just going to waste money. Now I understand why they're doing it, because Trump is pissing off the Europeans and all that stuff. But I think if we were rational, we would have a kind of a division of labor. Say, yeah, Europe, you're really good at that. We can sort of help play a role here and there. We'll be really good at that. You help play a role. Then there are going to be things where we all need to work together. My frustration is there was all this talk about that, and there was a real opening in the last sort of 8 years or whatever, but very little progress. You know, the U.S. administrations, they would talk a good game about global science and technology cooperation, but when it came down to actually crafting the regulations to make it easier for research partnerships to be engaged, to be enacted, they didn't do it anywhere near as they should have done it. And maybe they didn't think it was their purview to do it. I don't know what the answer is. But I think that's what we have to do. And I'm not giving up on that. I think 2028, maybe, you know, I mean, here's an optimistic scenario. China invades Taiwan. We go to war. We lose. They take it over. And just like the main thing that spurred us after the Cold War, it wasn't the rise of the Soviet Union. It wasn't that at all. It was the Soviets backing the North Koreans to invade South Korea. That was what happened. That's what made the big push in science, because then we knew what these people were really all about. By the way, I'm being facetious when I say the good news. I think one effect if China invades Taiwan is it could wake us up and say, damn, we can't afford these fights between the US and Canada. We can't afford these fights between Europe and the US. We've all got to work together to make sure that they don't extend their global hegemony, including in science. So that to me could be a wake-up call. I hope we don't have to get there. I hope we don't have to have that to get there, but I think it's maybe what it takes.
Okay, on that note.
Okay.
Jeff Kinder from University of Ottawa will close.
Thank you, Nick. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeff Kinder. I'm the executive in residence at the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa, and it's my role to say some thank yous. So first of all, thank you, Rob. Thought-provoking as always. I thought you stimulated a really interesting debate. Annie and Grace, thank you for your responses. Very insightful and helpful. And to Nick and the whole GW team, thank you for being a good host to the Team Canada. And I want to invite all of you to come to Ottawa next year for the next year's Bromley. Dr. Bromley was born in 1926, so next year will be a centennial celebration of Dr. Bromley. So we hope to have an extra special Bromley event next year. So please come to Canada. And meanwhile, I want to just echo that final thought that better that we collaborate between US and Canada than fight. So let's end on a positive note. Thank you, everyone.